All right, let's jump right in, folks. We've got a mountain of articles here all about this potential thaw in U.S.-Russia relations.
Yeah, pretty crazy, right?
I mean, just weeks ago, this seemed impossible. We're talking news pieces from like February 26th and 27th, 2025.
Reuters, the New York Times, the whole shebang.
Exactly. So let's dig into what this all means, who the big players are, and why everyone's a little on edge about it.
I think what's really striking is just how quickly things can change in geopolitics.
Well,
1 minute it's all tension and conflict, the next, well,
everyone's suddenly buddy-buddy.
not exactly buddy-buddy, but definitely a shift. I mean, we're talking about a potential reset after a decade of animosity and a war still going on in Ukraine.
And of course, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? This all seems to be happening right after Trump's return to the White House.
Yeah, defeating Biden in 24 almost feels like we've stepped back in time to 2017, but with even higher stakes this time.
Definitely. And what about Putin? He seems to be pretty pleased with how things are shaking out.
Oh yeah, no doubt. Putin sees Trump's victory as a chance to break free from what he perceives as, the West trying to hold Russia back.
And he hasn't been shy about expressing his, let's call it displeasure with the previous administration.
Right. There's that quote from one of the articles where he criticizes what he calls the, quote, ideological clichés, end quote, of the Biden era.
So, reading between the lines, he's basically saying good riddance to the old way of doing things. But the big question is, do you think he's being genuine? Or is this just some kind of strategic play?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Putin is a master strategist, always thinking a few steps ahead.
Like a chess grandmaster.
Exactly. So it's totally possible that he sees this as a real chance to reset relations with the U.S. But, on the other hand, he could be using the situation to just, further Russia's own interests.
I mean, let's not forget his ultimate goal, right? To restore Russia to what he sees as its rightful place on the world stage, a global superpower. Okay, so Putin might be happy about all this, but these articles also highlight how some European leaders are getting pretty nervous, especially in the UK and France.
Yeah, they've got good reason to be worried. Think about it. Europe's been on the front lines of this whole conflict, both geographically and politically.
They've poured resources into supporting Ukraine. Weapons, sanctions, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. And now there's this fear that they're going to be sidelined as the U.S. and Russia start cozying up, like their concerns are going to be ignored.
Specifically, we're talking about Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, and Emmanuel Macron in France. They've been pretty vocal about their anxieties.
And you can't blame them, right? They've invested so much in backing Ukraine. Now they're facing this possibility of being left out in the cold.
And to make matters even more complicated, there's this idea floating around in the UK about sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine once the war's over.
Oh, yeah, that's not going over well in Moscow.
Nope, not at all. Russia sees that as, like, the West trying to establish a military presence right on their doorstep. They're vehemently opposed to it.
Big time.
So it's kind of ironic, right? We've got this potential thaw between the U.S. and Russia, but it's causing a deep freeze in transatlantic relations.
Definitely a lot of diplomatic juggling going on. But hey, at least they are talking. I mean, there are these talks happening in Riyadh and working level officials meeting in Istanbul.
Wait, why Istanbul? Why not just meet in the U.S.?
That's an interesting detail from the articles. Apparently, Russian diplomats are a little, shall we say, hesitant about setting foot on U.S. soil. There were those expulsions a few years back.
Right.
So meeting in Istanbul, it's a compromise, a signal that they are willing to talk, but still not quite ready to, fully trust the U.S.
Baby steps.
Baby steps, exactly.
But what about the big elephant in the room, Ukraine?
Yeah, how can they possibly normalize relations without addressing the conflict that's still raging?
The articles say Ukraine isn't even on the agenda for these initial talks.
It's hard to imagine how you can separate the Russia problem from the Ukraine problem, right?
Right. And what does this mean for Zelensky, for the people of Ukraine? Are they just being left to fend for themselves while the superpowers, play their games?
It's a tough spot to be in, that's for sure. And then there's that whole thing about Putin warning against anyone trying to sabotage this rapprochement.
Yeah, that was pretty ominous. Russian intelligence will take action. Who is he talking about?
It's definitely a power play. Could be aimed at European leaders who are expressing concerns, or even at folks within Russia who might oppose closer ties with the U.S.
So not everyone's on board with this new direction.
Not at all. Putin's grip on power, it's not absolute. There are always factions within Russia who might see this whole thing as a threat.
So internal and external pressures all swirling around this.
Absolutely. And then, just to add another layer of complexity, you've got Putin meeting with Erdogan, the Turkish president.
Right. Turkey's been trying to play mediator in the Ukraine war, and Erdogan's always looking for ways to boost Turkey's global influence.
Exactly.
So it's not just a U.S.-Russia story anymore. It's like Putin's trying to build this whole network of alliances outside the traditional Western bloc.
Definitely seems that way.
Okay, so much to unpack here. Let's take a quick breather and just recap what we've got so far. We've got this surprising, even unsettling shift in U.S.-Russia relations. Putin seems to be embracing it, but some European leaders, like Starmer in the UK and Macron in France, they're understandably nervous.
Right, and let's not forget the big question mark hanging over all of this. Ukraine. What happens to them as these powerful nations try to figure out their own relationship?
The stakes are incredibly high. It's not just about two superpowers. It's about the future of Europe, Ukraine, and the entire global order. But hey, we've only just scratched the surface. Before the break, we were talking about Europe and how nervous they are about this whole U.S.-Russia thing. But let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the economic side of all this. It's not just about politics and, military stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the most interesting threads running through these articles is how economic interests might actually be driving this push for closer ties.
Yeah, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Russia's got all that natural gas and Europe needs it. But is this like a win-win situation? Can everyone get what they want?
Well, that's the big question. There are definitely some potential benefits for both sides, but there are also some real risks to consider.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, this whole rapprochement could throw a wrench into Europe's efforts to become less dependent on Russian energy.
Right, they've been working on that for years, trying to diversify their energy sources.
Exactly. So if the U.S. starts cozying up to Moscow and maybe even encourages more energy trade between Russia and Europe, well, it kind of undermines all that effort.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And then there's the whole issue of sanctions. I mean, if the U.S. and Russia start getting chummy, do those sanctions just disappear?
That's another key question. The sanctions have definitely hurt the Russian economy. There's no doubt about that. So lifting them would be a huge concession from the U.S.
Right, like what kind of message does that send to the rest of the world? Especially countries that the U.S. has sanctioned for, human rights abuses or whatever.
Exactly. It's a precedent. But then again, maybe there's some kind of middle ground, right? Maybe they strike a deal where some sanctions are eased in exchange for something from Russia.
Like what?
Well, maybe commitments on arms control or cooperation on things like fighting terrorism or something like that.
Okay, so lots to untangle on the economic front. But there's one more dimension we need to unpack, and it might be the most important one of all: the impact on the global order.
Absolutely. I mean, if this rapprochement actually works, if the U.S. and Russia really do manage to reset their relationship, it could completely change how power is distributed around the world.
Yeah, I mean, for decades, the U.S. has been the dominant force, leading the Western alliance, calling the shots, setting the rules of the game.
Right. But Putin, he has a different vision.
Right, that whole multipolar world thing he keeps talking about. What does that even mean?
Well, imagine a world where power isn't concentrated in just one country, but is spread out among several major players like Russia, China, maybe even Europe acting more independently.
Okay, so not a single superpower, but multiple power centers.
Exactly. A more decentralized and potentially a more unstable world.
So are we talking of a new Cold War here? A new global power struggle, but with different players and different ideologies?
It's too early to say for sure, but it's definitely a possibility. And the stakes are incredibly high. I mean, we're not just talking about political alliances and military strength here. We're talking about values, the values that will shape the future.
Like democracy versus authoritarianism.
Exactly. Individual liberty versus state control. A rules-based international order versus, might makes, right. These are the underlying currents that are driving this whole geopolitical drama.
Wow, this is getting heavy.
Yeah, it is. But it's important to understand these forces, to think critically about the choices that are being made, both by the U.S. and by Russia.
Okay, so let's just zoom out for a second and think big picture. What are the key takeaways from all this? What's essential for people to understand about this whole U.S.-Russia situation?
Well, first and foremost, this is incredibly complex. There are no easy answers.
Right, there's no clear good guy, bad guy scenario.
Exactly. There could be some benefits to this rapprochement, like less tension, more economic cooperation, maybe even progress on things like arms control. But there are also some serious risks.
Like what?
Well, especially for European security, for the future of Ukraine, and for the stability of the world order as we know it.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a world that already feels very divided and uncertain. There's growing distrust between countries, rising nationalism, this sense that the old rules just don't apply anymore.
Exactly. This rapprochement is both a symptom of that global unease and a potential catalyst for even greater change. It's like we're at a crossroads, and the decisions made today will have ripple effects for years to come.
So why should our listener care about all this? How does this diplomatic dance between the U.S. and Russia actually affect their life?
It affects everyone, whether they realize it or not. The decisions made by these world leaders will impact the global economy, the security environment, even the way our societies function. Staying informed, engaging in thoughtful discussions, and holding our leaders accountable for their choices is incredibly important.
That's exactly what the deep dive is all about, empowering you with the knowledge and insights you need to navigate this increasingly complex world. Now, for the last part of our deep dive, let's shift our focus to maybe the most intriguing and perhaps concerning aspect of this whole situation: Putin's domestic agenda and his potential use of Russian intelligence services.
Right. It's important to remember that this rapprochement isn't just about making nice with the U.S. It's also about strengthening Putin's control within Russia and advancing his vision for Russia's role in the world.
You're right, this whole thing raises a lot of questions. What's Putin's endgame here? Is he truly looking to build a more stable world? Or is he just manipulating the situation to his advantage? Welcome back to the Deep Dive, folks. We've been unpacking this potential shift in U.S.-Russia relations, looking at the politics, the economics, even the human side of things. But now it's time to zero in on, well, Vladimir Putin himself.
Yeah, you can't really understand this situation without taking a closer look at the man at the helm, right? What's he really after?
Exactly. I mean, remember that chilling warning he issued about using Russian intelligence to, take care of anyone who tries to sabotage this whole rapprochement thing. It's like there's more to this than just, making friends with the U.S. What's his game here?
Well, it's important to remember, right? This isn't just about improving relations with the U.S. It's about Putin advancing his vision for Russia and, let's be honest, consolidating his own power.
And you mentioned earlier that he might even be worried about pushback from within Russia. What's that all about?
Yeah, not everyone in Russia is on board with this whole sudden shift towards the U.S. There are powerful factions within the government, the military, even the intelligence services,
who see this as a betrayal.
Exactly. They see it as a betrayal of Russian interests. They're probably thinking, why are we suddenly cozying up to the enemy?
So is this rapprochement a sign of strength or a sign of weakness? Is Putin so confident that he can afford to make this bold move? Or is he actually feeling vulnerable?
That's a question a lot of analysts are asking, and there's no easy answer. On one hand, this whole thing could be seen as, a really shrewd power play, a way for Putin to outmaneuver the West and get what he wants. But on the other hand, it could be a sign that he's, a little desperate.
Desperate?
Yeah, like maybe he recognizes that Russia can't keep going it alone, that they need to find a way to cooperate with the U.S., at least for now.
It's fascinating and a bit scary to think about what's going on inside the Kremlin right now. What's Putin really thinking? What are his long-term plans?
Right, and to really understand his motives, I think we need to understand how the Russian system works, the power dynamics, the competing interests.
Especially the role of the intelligence services.
Absolutely. I mean, remember, Putin came up through the ranks of the KGB. He knows how to use the intelligence apparatus to achieve his goals, both domestically and on the world stage.
Okay, so let's talk about the FSB, Russia's main intelligence agency. What role are they playing in all this?
Well, the FSB is basically the successor to the KGB. They're involved in everything: counterterrorism, cybersecurity, silencing dissent, you name it.
They're like Putin's eyes and ears, making sure he stays in control.
Exactly. And they're not afraid to get their hands dirty. If Putin sees this rapprochement as essential to his plans, you can bet the FSB will be working overtime to make sure it happens.
So you're saying he might even be using them to, get rid of any internal opposition, people who might try to undermine this whole deal with the U.S.
It's definitely a possibility. Remember those articles we talked about, the ones mentioning a spike in cyber attacks against Russia? Well, Putin specifically ordered the FSB to, beef up their counterintelligence efforts.
Right, yeah.
That could be a sign that he's anticipating some pushback and he's, ready to use whatever means necessary to squash it.
It's like a digital arms race almost.
Yeah.
Where cyberspace is the battlefield and information or disinformation is the weapon.
Exactly. And it's a battle that's being fought not just between nations, but within nations as well. We're living in an era of information warfare where it's harder than ever to know what's true and what's not, and that makes it really easy to manipulate people.
Okay, so we've got Putin flexing his intelligence muscles, both at home and maybe abroad, but he's not the only one playing this game, right? I mean, Western intelligence agencies have got to be watching his every move.
Oh, absolutely. They're working overtime trying to figure out what Putin's up to, trying to counter Russian cyber attacks, protect their own interests. It's a high-stakes game of cat and mouse.
And a lot of it's happening in the shadows. Kind of spooky, right?
It can be. But it's important to remember that these intelligence agencies, they don't operate in a vacuum. They answer to political leaders, and their actions reflect their country's broader strategic goals.
Right, so it all comes back to politics in the end.
Always does. And it brings us back to that fundamental question. What's Putin's endgame? Is this rapprochement a genuine attempt to build a more stable world? Or is it just a way for him to gain power and advantage?
And what does it mean for the rest of us?
Well, I think it means we're living in a world that's becoming increasingly complex and unpredictable. The old rules are breaking down, new power dynamics are emerging, and it's more important than ever to stay informed and engage in critical thinking.
So we can't just be passive consumers of information. We have to question the narratives we're being fed, do our own research, and form our own opinions.
Exactly. And remember, this is a story that's still being written. We all have a role to play in shaping the future.
Well, that's a pretty good note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, looking at the political, the economic, the intelligence dimensions of this potential shift in U.S.-Russia relations.
And we've explored the very real human impact of this whole situation.
It's a story about power, ambition, the delicate balance between cooperation and conflict. And it's a story that highlights how important it is to understand different perspectives, think critically, and engage in thoughtful discussion.
We hope this deep dive has given you the knowledge and insights to form your own conclusions about what's happening in the world and what it might mean for the future. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.